The text came in at 6:47 on a Thursday evening while I was rinsing a coffee mug at my kitchen sink. My daughter's name lit up the screen, and under it, one line that didn't sound like her at all. "You're not on the guest list, Dad. I'm sorry. It's complicated. Please don't call tonight." I set the mug down so hard it cracked against the basin. 29 years I had raised that girl by myself after her mother died, and now she was telling me I wasn't welcome at her own wedding. I read it 4 times, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They never did. 2 hours later, at 8:52 p.m., my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, area code out of state. A man's voice, tight and formal, said, "Mr. Hale, I believe we need to talk. I don't think you understand who you almost just insulted, and I don't think we understood who you actually are. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If this opening pulled you in, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one. And before we go further, I want to be upfront with you. This story blends real patterns of family manipulation and financial elder abuse with dramatized details for the sake of the telling. Names, places, and certain events have been adjusted, but the lessons inside them are real, and I think they're worth sitting with until the end. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 64 years old, and 3 weeks before all of this happened, I thought the hardest chapter of my life was already behind me. Part 1: The Life I Built. I lost my wife, Diane, 4 years ago this coming spring. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 11 months. We'd been married 32 years. She was the one who talked me into leaving my job at a regional bank in my 40s and starting my own firm, a small private lending and financial consulting outfit that specialized in bailing out family businesses that had gotten in over their heads. Meridian Bridge Partners. It never made me famous. It made me comfortable, careful, and almost entirely anonymous, because the nature of the work meant staying quiet. You don't advertise the fact that you're the man holding the note on somebody's failing company. You just show up in the paperwork as a name on a signature line, buried 3 layers down in an LLC nobody bothers to look up. Our daughter, Claire, was 29. She'd inherited her mother's stubbornness and her mother's laugh, and after Diane passed, Claire and I got closer instead of further apart, the way grief sometimes does to people who let it. Sunday dinners. Long phone calls on Wednesday nights, just to talk about nothing. She worked as an interior designer for a boutique firm downtown, good at her job, proud of her independence, and for most of her 20s she'd dated exactly nobody worth mentioning. Then, 14 months ago, she met Daniel Ashford. Daniel was 31, handsome in the unbothered way that comes from never having had to try very hard, and the son of Richard and Victoria Ashford, a name that meant something in this city if you traveled in the right circles. Richard ran Ashford Development Group, a real estate firm with its name on 3 office towers and a country club renovation downtown. Victoria sat on the boards of 2 hospital foundations and the Symphony. They were, by every outward measure, the kind of family people described as old money, even though anyone who actually understood finance could have told you that most of that money was leveraged 6 ways from Sunday. I didn't know that yet. Not really. I just knew my daughter had fallen for a sweet, slightly soft young man who opened doors for her and remembered her coffee order, and who cried, actually cried, at his own engagement dinner when he got down on one knee in front of 40 guests at the Ashford Lake House. I like Daniel. I want to be honest about that from the start, because this story is not really about him being a villain. It's about what happens when good people get swallowed by the plans other people make for them. The trouble started small. It always does. Part 2: The Slow Fade. Wedding planning began in earnest about 5 months before the date, which had been set for the 2nd Saturday in June. At first, I was fully in it. Claire called me from the bridal shop to describe 3 different dress silhouettes over speakerphone while I sat in my den with a legal pad, taking notes like it was a client meeting, because that's the only way I know how to show someone I'm paying attention. Victoria Ashford took over the venue and catering almost immediately. That wasn't unusual. Mothers of the groom sometimes do, especially when they're paying for the bulk of it, and the Ashfords were paying for most of it, or at least that was the story everyone was told. I offered to contribute. Victoria declined, sweetly, over a phone call in February. "Oh, Robert, please, let us handle this one. You just show up and look handsome." I remember laughing at that. I didn't think anything of it. By March, I noticed I was hearing about decisions after they'd already been made instead of before. The venue had changed from a botanical garden to the Ashford Country Club ballroom, and I found out from a caterer's confirmation email that got accidentally forwarded to me instead of to Claire. The guest list had grown from 120 to nearly 300, and somewhere in that expansion, half my side of the family, my late wife's siblings, my old business partner Walter Green, 2 cousins Claire had grown up with, had quietly disappeared from the seating chart. I asked Claire about it at dinner on a Sunday in early April. She looked tired in a way that worried me, dark half-moons under her eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. "Victoria's just trying to keep the numbers manageable for the caterer," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's not personal, Dad. It's my sister-in-law, Claire. She's not exactly a stranger." "I know. I'll talk to her." She never brought it up again, and neither did I, because I told myself I was being an overprotective, slightly jealous father who didn't want to share his daughter with a new family. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the exact thought that almost cost me everything. I talked myself out of trusting my own instincts because the alternative, admitting something was wrong, was harder to face. In late April, I called Richard Ashford directly for the first time, mostly out of politeness, to ask if he wanted to have lunch and talk business to business, one father of the bride and groom to another. He was cordial on the phone, warm even, but he cancelled twice, and the third time his assistant called to reschedule instead of him. When we finally sat down at a steakhouse downtown on May 2nd, he spent most of the meal on his phone, apologizing between texts, telling me construction financing on the Baymorn Tower project was, in his words, eating my whole month alive. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly around his water glass. I noticed he ordered a second scotch before the appetizers even arrived. 40 years in finance teaches you to read a room, and the room I was sitting in that day did not read like old money at ease. It read like a man standing very still on a floor he suspected was about to give way. I should have paid closer attention right then. I didn't. I paid the check, shook his hand, and drove home telling myself it was none of my business. Part 3, the night of the text. The rehearsal dinner invitations went out on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of May. I know the date because I remember checking my mailbox every day that week, the way you do when you're waiting for something you've been promised. Claire had told me weeks earlier that the rehearsal dinner would be a small, intimate affair, family only, held at the Ashford Lake House, the same place Daniel had proposed. No invitation came. I told myself it was probably a digital invite this time, an email that had landed in spam. I checked. Nothing. On Thursday, June 5th, 12 days before the wedding, I called Claire around 6 in the evening to ask about the rehearsal dinner details, because I needed to know what time to be there and what to wear. She didn't pick up. I called again 40 minutes later. Straight to voicemail. At 6:47 p.m., the text arrived. "You're not on the guest list, Dad. I'm sorry. It's complicated. Please don't call tonight." I stood in my kitchen holding that cracked coffee mug and read it until the words blurred. Not the rehearsal dinner. The guest list. the wedding itself. My own daughter's wedding, 12 days away, and I had just been told, over text message, not to come. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for what came later. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder and heavier, a feeling like the floor of your own house shifting half an inch under your feet. I sat down at my kitchen table and I typed out 3 different replies and deleted every one of them, because none of them sounded like a father and all of them sounded like a wounded old man. I finally wrote, "Okay. Are you all right? That's all I care about." She didn't answer that night. At 8:52 p.m., my phone rang. An unfamiliar number, out-of-state area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mr. Hale," the voice said. Clipped, careful, a little too polite in the way people get when they're trying very hard to sound calm. "My name is Gerald Voss. I'm counsel for the Ashford family. I believe we need to talk. I don't think you fully understand who you almost just insulted tonight, and frankly, sir, I don't think we understood who you actually are until about an hour ago." I sat very still at my kitchen table. "I'm listening, Mr. Voss." "There's been a misunderstanding regarding the guest list," he said. "I'd like to fix it. Tonight, if possible. Could we meet?" That sentence right there is where this story really begins. Because a family attorney does not call a father at 9 o'clock at night to fix a seating chart. Something else had happened in that gap between 6:47 and 8:52, and I intended to find out exactly what it was before I agreed to anything. If you're still with me, drop the word family in the comments so I know you're following along, because what I found over the next 10 days was far worse than a wedding invitation. Part 4: What 40 years in finance teaches you. I told Gerald Voss I'd call him back. I hung up, and instead of picking up the phone again, I did what I have done for 40 years whenever something in a deal smelled wrong. I got out a legal pad and I started writing down a timeline. February, Victoria takes over planning, my involvement quietly shrinks. March, guest list changes without me being told, my side of the family cut. May 2nd, Richard Ashford, visibly anxious, mentions construction financing trouble at Baymorn Tower. June 5th, 6:47 p.m., I'm told I'm not on the guest list. June 5th, 8:52 p.m., the family lawyer calls, suddenly desperate to fix it. Something had happened between those 2 texts that had nothing to do with seating charts. Somebody, somewhere in that 2-hour window, had learned something about me that changed the entire equation. And the only thing I could think of that made any sense was this: somebody had finally looked up my name. Here is a detail I hadn't mentioned yet, because for most of my life it hadn't mattered to anyone outside a very small circle. Meridian Bridge Partners, the firm I built after leaving the bank, doesn't just do consulting. For the last 11 years, we've also quietly acquired distressed commercial debt, loans that regional banks want off their books because the borrower is underwater and getting worse. We buy the paper at a discount, we restructure, sometimes we foreclose, sometimes we work something out. It's not glamorous. It's not something I ever talk about at dinner parties. But 6 months earlier, in December, my firm had acquired a defaulted construction loan on a stalled office tower downtown called the Baymorn Tower, held through a holding entity 3 layers deep called Sycamore Ridge Holdings LLC. I had not made the connection until that night at my kitchen table, staring at my own timeline in my own handwriting. Baymorn Tower. Richard Ashford's project. The one he'd mentioned at lunch, hands shaking around his water glass. I own the debt on my future son-in-law's father's company, and I never knew it, because I never look at the names behind the shell companies my own analysts manage. That's not arrogance. That's just how the business works when you're running 11 active positions at once and you trust your team to handle the details. Somebody at Ashford Development, in trying to find out why the father of the bride had suddenly become a problem worth investigating, must have run my name and stumbled straight into the fact that Robert Hale of Meridian Bridge Partners was the same Robert Hale who, through a holding company they'd never bothered to trace back, held $91 million of defaulted debt currently threatening to bury their family business. I sat with that for a long time that night. Then I called my head analyst, a sharp 34-year-old named Priya Anand who had been with me for 6 years, and I asked her a question I never thought I'd need to ask about my own daughter's future in-laws. Priya, pull everything we have on Sycamore Ridge and Baymorn Tower. I want to know exactly how much trouble Richard Ashford is in, and I want to know it by morning. Is everything okay, Robert? She asked. She could hear something in my voice. I don't know yet, I told her. That's exactly why I'm calling. Part 5, The First Discoveries. Priya called me back at 7:14 the next morning, Friday, June 6, 11 days before the wedding. I hadn't slept. It's worse than a stalled tower, she said. Ashford Development has 3 other projects leveraged against the same lines of credit. 2 regional banks have already called in personal guarantees. Richard Ashford has pledged nearly everything, the country club stake, 2 commercial properties, even the lake house, as collateral across multiple facilities. If Baymorn doesn't close its financing gap in the next 30 days, the whole structure comes down. Not just the tower. All of it. How much of a gap are we talking? 14 million, give or take, before the June 30th covenant deadline. I sat with my coffee going cold, the same way it had the night before, and I did the math a man in my line of work does automatically. $14 million. A wedding 12 days away. A guest list suddenly and inexplicably scrubbed of the one man in that family's orbit who happened to control the exact debt threatening to sink them, right at the moment his daughter's trust fund, a fund I had personally established for Claire 8 years earlier, funded by proceeds from selling my stake in my first company, worth just north of $2 million, was about to become, on paper, jointly accessible to her husband upon marriage under the standard terms of the trust document. Claire had signed at 22. Terms that had never been updated because nobody had ever had a reason to update them. I want to be very clear with you about what I mean when I say I felt the floor shift under me. Because up until that exact moment, I had assumed the worst thing happening in my daughter's life was a slightly cold future mother-in-law and an overcrowded seating chart. What I was starting to see instead was the outline of something engineered, a business in free fall, a wedding date that happened to fall precisely inside a 30-day covenant window, and a father of the bride who had just been quietly, deliberately erased from proximity to the one document that could make or break the family fortune. I called Warren Sinclair that morning. Warren had been my attorney for over 20 years, a careful, silver-haired man who had drafted Claire's original trust and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive. Warren, I need you to pull Claire's trust documents. All of them. And I need you to tell me honestly whether anyone has requested an amendment or a distribution in the last 6 months. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me before he said a single word that my instincts had been right. Robert, he said slowly, I was going to call you this week anyway. 3 weeks ago, my office received a request, signed by Claire, to add a co-trustee to her account ahead of the wedding. Standard enough on its face. Married couples do this sometimes. But the proposed co-trustee isn't Daniel. Who is it? Victoria Ashford. I stopped breathing for a second. Claire signed that? Her signature's on the form. I haven't processed it yet, I flagged it for a follow-up call with her directly, which hadn't happened yet. Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Has anyone mentioned Claire seeming different lately? Withdrawn? Exhausted? Anxious in a way that doesn't track? I thought about the dark half-moons under her eyes at that Sunday dinner in April. I thought about how she hadn't met my gaze when she told me the guest list thing wasn't personal. I thought about 12 days of near silence leading up to her own wedding. Yes, I said quietly. For months. Then I think, Warren said, that we need to find out exactly what's been happening to your daughter before this wedding happens, not after. Part 6. Watching, not confronting. I did not call Claire that day. Everything in me wanted to drive straight to her apartment and demand answers, and everything I have ever learned in 4 decades of untangling other people's financial disasters told me that would be the fastest way to lose whatever advantage I still had. If Victoria Ashford and Richard's people had spent months slowly maneuvering my daughter into signing away shared control of a $2 million trust 12 days before a wedding timed suspiciously close to a $14 million debt deadline, then confronting them with half the picture would only give them time to finish covering their tracks. So I did the thing I know how to do. I documented. I called Priya back and asked her to pull every filing connected to Sycamore Ridge Holdings, every public record on Ashford Development's finances, every note in our own servicing file on the Baymorn loan. I called an old friend from my banking days, a forensic accountant named Dale Whitman who had done private investigative work for me twice before on distressed acquisitions, and I asked him to do something quieter and more personal, to find out, discreetly, what exactly had been happening in Claire's life for the last several months. Not to spy on my daughter out of some paranoid impulse, but because if she was being isolated and pressured, I needed proof of it, not just a father's gut feeling. Dale called me back that Sunday evening, June 8th. Robert, I want to tell you what I found, and I want you to sit down first. I'm sitting. Claire's calendar, her work calendar, which her assistant partially manages and which is technically a shared document with the design firm, shows a pattern. Every single week for the last 4 months, she's had a standing appointment labeled a wedding planning VA. Every single one of those meetings happened at the Ashford estate, never in public, never with a third party present except occasionally Daniel. Her design firm's assistant told me, off the record, that Claire has cancelled 3 lunches with old friends in the last 2 months, always citing wedding stress. And Robert, she filled 2 prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication in the last 10 weeks that she never had before. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Is she okay physically? As far as I can tell, yes. This isn't a poisoning case, if that's what you're asking. This looks like something else. It looks like isolation. Somebody's been keeping her busy, keeping her anxious, keeping her away from anyone who might ask questions, including you. I thought about Victoria's sweet voice on the phone back in February. Oh, Robert, please, let us handle this one. I thought about how easily I had let myself be handled, too, right alongside my daughter. Both of us maneuvered gently out of the room while a family fortune quietly repositioned itself around us. There's one more thing, Dale said. I found an email. It bounced to me through a mutual contact who does event photography for the Ashfords, not illegally obtained. Robert, it was forwarded to the wrong recipient by mistake and the guy panicked and brought it to me because he knew I did work for you. It's from Victoria Ashford to Gerald Voss, dated May 30th. I'm going to read it to you exactly as written. I gripped the phone. Gerald, confirm the trustee amendment is filed before the ceremony, not after. Once it's in place and the wedding is finalized, Robert Hale becomes a non-issue regardless of what he does or doesn't know. Keep him occupied with the seating chart until then. The Baymorn covenant closes June 30th. We need the trust liquidity available well before that. Do not let Claire speak to her father alone in the next 2 weeks. She's already asking questions. I sat in my kitchen with my eyes closed for a long moment, listening to my own pulse. She's already asking questions, I said out loud. That's what it says, Robert. Your daughter's been fighting this on her own, quietly, and losing. Part 7, Building the Case. Before I go further, let me tell you about the neighbor who almost stopped me from finding any of this at all, because in hindsight, she was the one who first cracked the door open, and I nearly walked right past her. Margaret Doyle had lived 2 houses down from me for 11 years, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s who still kept a garden that put mine to shame and who had known Claire since she was in high school. On the Saturday after the guest list text, June 7th, she caught me at my mailbox the way old neighbors do, with a look on her face that told me she'd been waiting for the right moment to say something. Robert, I don't want to speak out of turn, she said, but Claire stopped by here in April, just to sit on my porch the way she used to when she was a girl. She didn't say much, but she cried for almost an hour, and when I asked her what was wrong, all she said was, "I don't think anyone's listening to me anymore, Mrs. Doyle. Not even my dad." I've been thinking about that ever since, and when I heard you weren't on the guest list, I thought you should know. I want to be honest with you. That conversation stung more than almost anything else in this whole story, because it meant my own daughter had been quietly signaling distress for months, in small ways, to anyone who happened to be paying attention, and I had been too wrapped up in my own hurt feelings about a seating chart to notice. I thanked Margaret, and I went home, and I sat with that particular kind of guilt for a long while before I picked up the phone and called Dale Whitman that same evening instead of waiting until Sunday like I'd originally planned. I want to pause here and tell you something plainly, because I think it matters. I did not, at this point, know whether Daniel, the young man I'd genuinely come to like, who cried at his own proposal, knew what his mother was doing. I hoped he didn't. I needed to find out, and I needed to find out in a way that would hold up, because a bounced email and a private investigator's hunch was not enough to save my daughter from a scheme that had clearly been engineered by people far more comfortable with paperwork than I was willing to underestimate. Monday, June 9th, 9 days before the wedding, I called Warren Sinclair back into the case formally. I want you to do 3 things, I told him. First, do not process that trustee amendment under any circumstances until I say otherwise. Second, I want a legal read on whether what Victoria's proposing, adding herself as co-trustee days before a wedding, using a document Claire may not have fully understood, constitutes undue influence or outright fraud. Third, I want you to help me figure out how to get proof, real proof, of what's actually being said to Claire behind closed doors, because right now what I have is a bounced email and a hunch. Warren was quiet for a moment. Robert, you're describing evidence gathering in a case that could eventually involve criminal fraud, not just a family dispute. If this goes where I think it might go, you need to be careful about how that evidence is obtained. A recording made without consent in some contexts is inadmissible or even illegal, depending on how it's done. Let's do this the right way. New York and most states allow one-party consent recording, meaning if I was a party to a conversation, or if I had my own daughter's consent, recording it was legal. Warren walked me through exactly what would and wouldn't hold up. And then he said the thing that mattered most. Talk to Claire. Not the family. Her. Alone, somewhere Victoria can't reach her, and ask her directly what's been happening. If she tells you the truth, everything gets easier. I called Claire that evening and asked her to meet me for coffee the next morning, not at her apartment, not near the Ashford estate, but at a small diner 3 blocks from her old college dorm, a place we used to go together when she was 20 and broke and needed her father to buy her breakfast. I didn't mention Victoria. I didn't mention the trust. I just said, I miss you. 20 minutes. Just us. She showed up Tuesday morning, June 10th, looking thinner than I remembered, the kind of thin that comes from stress instead of diet, dark circles under her eyes that no concealer fully hid. She slid into the booth across from me and for a moment neither of us said anything. Dad, about the guest list. Claire, I said gently, I don't care about the guest list. I care about you. You look exhausted, sweetheart, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has someone been pressuring you about anything? Money, paperwork, anything at all? Her hands, wrapped around her coffee cup, started to shake. And then, for the first time in 4 months, my daughter started to cry in front of me. Victoria wants me to add her to my trust, she said, voice breaking. She said it's just a formality, that all the Ashford wives do it, that it protects the family in case anything happens. But every time I try to ask Daniel about it, he changes the subject, and every time I try to slow down and read the paperwork carefully, Victoria tells me I'm being paranoid and ungrateful, and Dad, I signed something 3 weeks ago and I don't even remember what it said because I was so tired, and she kept telling me we had to get it done before the wedding or the lawyers would delay everything. Did anyone tell you not to talk to me? She looked down at the table. Victoria said you'd try to talk me out of the wedding if you knew we were combining finances early. She said you never liked the idea of me marrying into money, that you'd see it as me being taken advantage of, and that it would just cause a fight before the wedding that nobody needed. I didn't want to believe her, Dad, but I was so tired of everyone being upset with everyone, I just wanted it to be easy. I reached across that diner table and took both of my daughter's hands. Claire, listen to me very carefully. I don't think you were being paranoid. I think you were right to ask questions, and I think somebody has been working very hard to make sure you didn't get answers. I need you to trust me for the next week, and I need you to not sign anything else, and I need you to let me help you, even if it's uncomfortable. Can you do that? She nodded, tears still running down her face. What's happening, Dad? Why did they take you off the guest list? I told her everything, as gently as I could. The Baymont Tower debt. The email Dale had found. The timing of the trustee amendment against the covenant deadline. I watched my daughter's face go from confusion to disbelief to something harder, something I recognized because I'd seen it on my own face in the mirror 3 nights earlier. They were never going to let me be at my own wedding surrounded by people who'd ask hard questions, I said. And they were never going to let you be surrounded by anyone who'd tell you to slow down and read the fine print. Part 8. Setting the Trap. Claire agreed to help me, and I want to tell you that this was the hardest thing I asked of her, harder than anything that came after. I asked my own daughter, 12 days before her wedding, to go home and act like nothing had changed, while wearing a small recording device Dale Whitman fitted into a bracelet clasp, legal because she was a consenting party to every conversation it captured. Wednesday, June 11th, 6 days before the wedding. Claire went to the Ashford estate for what was billed as a final dress fitting and seating chart review. At 2:14 p.m., the bracelet picked up a conversation between Claire and Victoria in the estate sunroom. I looked at the amendment again. Claire said, her voice carefully casual. I just want to understand it better before the wedding. Sweetheart, it's already been sent to the attorney. There's nothing left to understand. It simply gives me signing authority alongside you, in case anything happens while you and Daniel are on your honeymoon. It's protective, that's all. But it says you'd have authority over withdrawals up to the full balance. That seems like more than just emergency access. A pause. Then Victoria's voice, cooler now. Claire, I know your father has been filling your head with something. He called Richard's office, did you know that? Poking around in things that are none of his business. I understand he's protective, but this family does things a certain way, and if you want to be part of it, you need to trust us the way Daniel trusts us. I do trust Daniel. Then trust his mother, too. The amendment gets finalized before Saturday. That's not a request, dear. It's simply how this works. I sat in my car outside a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Ashford estate, listening through Dale's receiver, and I felt something settle in my chest that was colder than anger. It was clarity. That's not a request, dear. My daughter had been told, in plain language, 6 days before her wedding, that she did not actually have a choice. Thursday, June 12th, 5 days before the wedding. Richard Ashford himself entered the conversation, this time in his home office, with Claire present under the pretense of discussing the seating arrangement for the head table. The bracelet caught it clearly. The Baymorn closing needs liquidity by the 30th, Richard said, his voice tight, exhausted in a way that made me almost feel sorry for him, right up until the next sentence. If the trust amendment isn't finalized before the wedding, the bank sees a gap in our collateral position and the whole facility could get called. We need this done, Victoria. I don't care how. It'll be done, Victoria said. Claire's compliant. She always has been. Robert's the only variable, and he's handled. Handled how? He's off the list. He won't be within 100 feet of that ceremony to whisper doubts in anyone's ear. By the time he figures out what's happening, the amendment will already be filed, the wedding will already have happened, and it won't matter what a bitter old man with a grudge thinks about it. I want you to notice something in that sentence, because it took me a full day to notice it myself. He's off the list. They had cut me from the guest list not out of pettiness, not out of some social slight, but as a calculated, deliberate move to keep me physically and informationally distant while they finalized access to my daughter's trust before a deadline that could sink their entire family fortune. My daughter's wedding day had been chosen, in part, as a legal and emotional pressure point. If you're still with me, type evidence in the comments, because what happened next is the part where everything I'd built quietly, for 11 years, without ever meaning to, came crashing straight into their plan. Part 9, the 2-hour window. Here is what I now believe happened on the night of June 5th, pieced together afterward from documents, from Gerald Voss's own later statements, and from what Richard finally admitted in a much later conversation I'll get to. At 6:47 p.m. That Thursday, acting on Victoria's instructions, Claire sent me the text removing me from the guest list, believing, because she'd been told, that it was a temporary caterer-related fix and not a permanent exile. Almost immediately afterward, feeling guilty, Claire apparently mentioned to Daniel that she felt terrible about it, and Daniel, in turn, mentioned it to his father in a phone call meant to smooth things over. Richard, always a details man even in the middle of a financial collapse, asked his assistant to double-check something before responding to any fallout, the same thing every prudent businessman checks before deciding how much a slighted father-in-law actually matters. Who exactly is Robert Hale, and does he have any leverage over us? At 7:40 p.m., Richard's assistant ran a basic corporate search. Buried 3 entities deep, behind Sycamore Ridge Holdings LLC, behind a parent fund called Meridian Bridge Capital Partners II, sat my name as managing principal, tied directly to the note holder on the defaulted Baymorn Tower loan. At 8:15 p.m., according to what I later learned from Gerald Voss's own billing records, Richard Ashford called his attorney in a state described in Voss's private notes as near panic, having just realized that the man his family had quietly cut out of a wedding 12 days earlier was the same man who, at any point in the next 24 days, could call the entire Baymorn loan due and collapse their remaining assets. At 8:52 p.m., Gerald Voss called me, hoping to smooth things over before I had time to connect any dots myself. Not realizing that the dots had already connected themselves the moment I read my own daughter's text message and felt the floor shift under my feet. They had spent months engineering a plan to quietly extract control of my daughter's trust before their empire collapsed under its own debt, never once imagining that the same debt was already sitting in my portfolio, and that cutting me out of a guest list would be the single move that made me start looking closely enough to find it. Part 10. Confirming the fraud. Friday, June 13th, 4 days before the wedding, Warren Sinclair called with the legal read I had been waiting for. Robert, I've reviewed the trustee amendment language against New York's estates, powers, and trusts law. What Victoria is asking Claire to sign isn't a standard emergency provision. It gives her essentially unilateral authority over the trust's full balance, without requiring your daughter's countersignature for withdrawals above a certain threshold. Combined with what you've told me about the recorded conversations, the explicit statement about needing liquidity before the Baymorn Covenant deadline, the acknowledgement that Claire is being kept from asking questions, the deliberate isolation from you, this is no longer a family dispute. This is financial exploitation, potentially fraud in the inducement, and depending on how the amendment gets used after signing, it could constitute larger-scale wire fraud if trust assets get moved across state lines to cover the Baymorn debt. What do we do? First, we do not let that amendment get filed. I'll call the trust administrator this afternoon and place a formal hold, citing concerns about undue influence. That alone is within my authority as counsel of record. Second, I think it's time to bring in someone outside this family entirely. A financial crimes detective, or better yet, given the interstate elements and the size of the numbers involved, the FBI's white-collar division has a local field office that handles exactly this kind of case. I called Detective Sarah Bell of the local financial crimes unit that same afternoon, a contact Dale Whitman had worked with before. I laid out everything, the timeline, the bounced email, the recorded conversations, the trust amendment, the Baymorn Covenant deadline 4 days before the wedding I owned the debt on. Detective Bell listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Hale, what you've described, if it holds up the way you're describing it, is a coordinated effort to defraud your daughter of trust assets under emotional and financial duress, timed deliberately around a debt obligation you happen to control. I want copies of everything you have by tomorrow morning, and I want to bring in a colleague of mine who works interstate financial fraud with the Bureau, because if money moves across state lines here, this stops being a local matter." That colleague turned out to be Special Agent Marcus Lowry, a calm, methodical man in his late 40s who arrived at my house Saturday morning, June 14th, 3 days before the wedding, and spent for hours going through every document, every recording, every timeline entry with the patience of a man who had clearly done this 100 times before and never once lost his composure doing it. "Here's what we're going to do," Agent Lowry said finally. "We're not going to move on this before the wedding date unless your daughter is in immediate danger, which based on everything you've shown me, she isn't. This looks like financial coercion, not physical harm. But we are going to let this play out just a little further, because right now what we have is strong circumstantial evidence and one clear recorded admission. If we can get one more clean conversation, ideally with Richard or Victoria explicitly acknowledging the fraud in a setting where they don't know they're being recorded and can't later claim entrapment, we go from a strong case to an airtight one." "You want me to keep pretending I don't know," I said. "I want you to let them think their plan worked," Agent Lowry said. "For just a little longer." Part 11, The Rehearsal Dinner. Sunday, June 15th, 2 days before the wedding. The rehearsal dinner I had not been invited to was still scheduled for that evening at the Ashford Lake house. Claire, at my request and with Agent Lowry's blessing, told Victoria that morning that she wanted her father there after all, that excluding him had made her deeply uncomfortable, and that she'd decided, as the bride, it was her call to make. Victoria, according to Claire, went very quiet on the phone, then said, tightly, "If that's what you want, sweetheart, of course. We'll set another place." At 6:30 p.m. that evening, I walked into the Ashford Lake house for the first time in months, wearing a suit Diane had once told me made me look like I knew exactly what I was doing, and carrying, in my breast pocket, absolutely nothing except my phone, because Agent Lowry had made clear that this evening's recording, if it happened at all, needed to come from Claire's consent-based device, not mine, to keep the chain of evidence clean. Richard greeted me at the door with a handshake that lasted a half-second too long. his smile the particular kind of smile people wear when they are recalculating a plan in real time behind their own eyes. "Robert. Good to see you. Glad you could make it after all. Wouldn't miss my daughter's rehearsal dinner," I said pleasantly. "Wedding's in 2 days. Feels like everything's finally coming together." Victoria appeared a moment later, composed, gracious, the picture of a hostess. "Robert, we're so glad you're here. I hope there are no hard feelings about the confusion with the guest count." "None at all," I said. "These things happen. I understand you've had a lot on your plate lately. Construction financing, I hear, can be brutal this time of year." I watched something flicker behind Victoria's eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We sat down to dinner. 40 guests, candlelight, the lake going gold and then violet as the sun dropped behind the tree line. I played my part. I toasted Daniel and Claire with real warmth, because whatever his parents had done, I still believed, and still believe, that Daniel loved my daughter honestly. I laughed at Richard's jokes. I let Victoria seat me at the far end of the table, exactly where she wanted me, out of earshot of the head table conversation, not realizing that Claire, sitting beside Daniel, had her bracelet recording every word. At 8:40 p.m., during the toasts, Victoria pulled Richard aside near the bar, believing themselves alone. Claire, refilling her water glass nearby, caught it all. "The amendment's been held up," Victoria said quietly, urgency cutting through her hostess' smile. "The administrator's asking questions. We need it signed and filed by Monday morning, before the wedding, or we lose the liquidity window before payment's covenant deadline." "And if Robert's poking around?" "He's here tonight being perfectly pleasant, which tells me he doesn't know anything yet. We finalized the amendment the morning of the wedding, before the ceremony, while everyone's occupied with hair and makeup and flowers. Claire signs it as a formality between the rehearsal and the vows. Nobody questions paperwork on a wedding day. By Saturday night, we have access to $2 million of liquidity and Baymorn closes clean before the 30th. And Robert finds out eventually. By then it won't matter," Victoria said. "It'll already be done." I stood at the far end of that table, glass of wine in hand, watching my daughter's future mother-in-law plan to defraud her on her own wedding morning, and I understood, with total clarity, that the confession Agent Larry needed had just been recorded, cleanly, in my daughter's own presence, 4 feet from where I stood pretending not to notice a thing. Part 12, The Wedding Morning That Never Happened as Planned. Monday, June 16th, the day before the wedding. I called Agent Larry at 7 a.m. and played him the recording from Claire's bracelet. "That's it," he said. "That's the confession. Explicit intent, explicit timeline, explicit acknowledgement of concealment from you. Mr. Hale, I want to move before that amendment gets anywhere near a signature tomorrow morning. Can you and Claire meet us at the field office at 9? We met with Agent Lowry, Detective Bell, and an assistant U.S. attorney named Rebecca Chen that morning. They listened to the recordings in full, reviewed the bounced email, reviewed the trust documents Warren had flagged and frozen. By 11 o'clock, Rebecca Chen looked up from the file and said, "Mr. Hale, Ms. Hale, we have more than enough here for federal wire fraud charges, and depending on what we find when we execute a search on Ashford Development's financial records, potentially bank fraud as well, given how they've represented their collateral position to lenders. I'd like to move on this tomorrow morning, before the ceremony, at the estate, where the amendment signing is scheduled to happen. We'll have agents in place, low profile, ready to act the moment paperwork changes hands." Claire sat very still through all of it, and when it was over, she asked the only question that mattered to her. "What happens to Daniel?" Agent Larry's voice softened slightly. based on everything we've seen so far, your fiancé appears to be exactly as much in the dark as you were. We're not targeting him unless evidence changes that. But Miss Hale, I need you to understand, tomorrow is not going to go the way you planned it. I'm sorry. Claire nodded, tears in her eyes, and said quietly, "Good. It shouldn't." Tuesday, June 17th, the wedding day. At 8:15 a.m., exactly as recorded, Victoria arrived at the bridal suite with the trust amendment and a notary in tow, telling Claire it needed to be signed quickly, before the makeup artist arrives, just a formality. Claire, coached carefully by Warren the night before, took the document, read it slowly, and asked, "Why does this give you unilateral withdrawal authority without my countersignature? That's not what you told me the first time." Victoria's smile tightened. "Claire, we don't have time for this today of all days." "Then we'll make time," I said, stepping into the doorway of the bridal suite, where I had been standing, with Claire's knowledge, for exactly this moment. Victoria's face went white. "Robert, what are you doing in here? This is—" "I know exactly what this is, Victoria," I said. "I know about Baymont Tower. I know about the $14 million covenant deadline on the 30th. I know you needed access to my daughter's trust before then, and I know you timed this amendment to be signed this morning, between hair and makeup, so nobody would ask questions. I know because I hold the note on Baymont Tower myself, and I know because my daughter has been recording every conversation you've had with her for the last week." The room went completely silent. Gerald Voss, who had arrived to witness the signing, actually took a step backward, as though putting physical distance between himself and what was coming. Richard Ashford appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn by the silence, and understood everything the instant he saw my face. "Robert," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." "We already are," I said. "And there are 2 federal agents in the parking lot who'd like to join us." Part 13, The Arrests. At 8:52 a.m., exactly, Agent Lowry and 3 additional agents entered the Ashford estate. Victoria was placed under arrest in the bridal suite hallway, still holding the unsigned trust amendment. Gerald Voss was detained separately for questioning regarding his role in drafting and concealing the document's true terms. Richard, standing frozen by the window, was informed he was being detained pending further investigation into Ashford Development's collateral misrepresentations to its lenders, a separate but related thread that Detective Bell's Financial Crimes Unit had been quietly pulling since Friday. Daniel found out standing in his tuxedo in the estate's front hall, 45 minutes before he was supposed to be at the altar, watching 2 federal agents walk his mother out to a waiting car. I will never forget the look on his face, not anger at me, not even confusion at first, just a kind of collapsing disbelief, the look of a man watching every assumption he'd ever made about his own family come apart in real time. He found Claire in the bridal suite a few minutes later. I stepped out to give them privacy, but I could hear enough through the door. "Did you know?" he asked her, voice cracking. "No," Claire said. "I found out 5 days ago. I've been recording your mother because I was terrified and I didn't know what else to do." "I didn't know either," Daniel said. "Claire, I swear to you, I had no idea." "I believe you," she said. "But I can't marry into this today. Not like this. Maybe not ever, until I understand exactly how much you did or didn't know." There was no wedding that afternoon. 300 guests arrived at the Ashford Country Club ballroom to find the ceremony cancelled, and I will tell you honestly, watching my daughter walk out of that estate in her wedding dress, not toward an altar but toward my car, holding my hand instead of anyone else's, was one of the hardest and, strangely, one of the proudest moments of my life. Part 13.5, The Quiet Days After. I should tell you what the days immediately following the cancelled wedding actually looked like, because it wasn't dramatic in the way the arrests were. It was quiet, and it was hard in a different way. Claire moved back into her old bedroom for 6 weeks, still in boxes from an apartment lease she'd been about to break for a life with Daniel she no longer trusted. She barely spoke for the first several days, and I let her have that silence, because I remembered exactly what it felt like after Diane died, the way grief and betrayal both need room to breathe before they can be talked about honestly. On the 4th night, she came downstairs at nearly midnight and sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd first read that text message, and she said, "I keep replaying every conversation with Victoria, trying to figure out the exact moment I should have known. I don't think there was one moment, Dad. I think it was 100 small moments, and I let every single one of them go because I didn't want to be the difficult one." "You weren't difficult," I told her. "You were careful." There's a difference, and it took me most of my life to learn it too. She started seeing a therapist that same week, a calm, steady woman named Dr. Patel who specialized in financial abuse and coercive control within families, a specialty I hadn't even known existed until Warren Sinclair recommended her. Claire went twice a week for the better part of a year, and I went with her twice, at Dr. Patel's suggestion, so that we could talk together about the ways I had also, without meaning to, made it harder for Claire to come to me sooner, the Sunday dinners where I'd let a strange answer slide because I didn't want to start a fight, the months where my own hurt feelings about being excluded had almost eclipsed my worry about why. Part 14, Building the Case. Over the following weeks, Agent Larry's investigation expanded well beyond the trust amendment. Forensic accountants working with Detective Bell's unit found that Richard Ashford had misrepresented the collateral value of 3 separate properties to 2 different regional banks in order to secure financing extensions on Ashford Development's failing projects, a pattern of bank fraud that predated the wedding scheme by at least 2 years. Gerald Voss, under pressure from federal prosecutors and facing his own potential disbarment, agreed to cooperate fully, turning over draft versions of the trust amendment that showed the language had been deliberately revised 3 separate times to obscure the unilateral withdrawal authority, each revision made after Claire had raised questions about the previous draft. Victoria Ashford was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted fraud against a trust beneficiary, and financial exploitation, a charge that, prosecutors explained, applies not only to the elderly but to any beneficiary manipulated through isolation and deception into signing away assets under false pretenses. Richard Ashford faced separate federal bank fraud charges tied to the collateral misrepresentations. Gerald Voss, in exchange for his cooperation, pleaded to a single count of aiding and abetting fraud and avoided the harsher charges his colleagues faced. Daniel was never charged. Agent Larry's team found no evidence he had known about the scheme, and Claire's own testimony confirmed what the recordings had already shown, that he had been kept in the dark as deliberately as she had. He testified for the prosecution eventually, describing what it felt like to learn, in the space of one morning, that his mother had engineered his own wedding as a financial extraction event. "I did not call the Baymorn loan due. I want to tell you why, because I think it matters." Once the fraud came to light, the loan's collateral position became part of an active federal investigation, and calling it due immediately would have complicated the case and likely destroyed any chance of the associated employees and subcontractors at Ashford Development keeping their jobs while the legal process unfolded. Meridian Bridge Partners worked instead with a court-appointed receiver to restructure the debt fairly, ensuring the company's remaining viable assets could be sold in an orderly way that paid back creditors, including my own firm, without punishing 300 employees who had nothing to do with what Victoria and Richard had done. Some things, I've learned, are better resolved through patience than through leverage, even when you finally have all the leverage in the world. Part 15, The Trial. The trial began the following March, 9 months after the wedding that never happened. I testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the timeline exactly as I've walked you through it here, the guest list text, the 2-hour gap before Gerald Voss's phone call, the discovery of the Baymorn connection, the recordings Claire had made at real personal risk. Claire testified as well, and I have never been prouder of her than I was watching her sit in that witness box, hand steady, voice clear, describing what it felt like to be told, again and again, that questioning her own finances made her paranoid and ungrateful. She told me trust was something I owed the family, Claire said on the stand, looking directly at Victoria for the first time since the arrest. I know now that trust is something you earn, not something you're guilted into. I wish I'd understood that sooner. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Victoria Ashford was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a trust beneficiary, and 1 count of witness tampering related to instructions found in a text to Gerald Voss instructing him to discourage Claire from consulting outside counsel. She was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Richard Ashford was convicted separately on the bank fraud charges tied to the collateral misrepresentations and received 7 years, to run partially concurrent with restitution obligations that, combined with the sale of the family's remaining assets, ultimately repaid the defrauded banks and, through the court-appointed receivership, made Meridian Bridge Partners whole on the Baymorn note as well. Gerald Voss, having cooperated fully, received 18 months and was permanently disbarred. I sat in that courtroom on the final day of sentencing and watched Victoria Ashford stand in a plain grey suit. No longer the polished hostess who had once told me over the phone to just show up and look handsome, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly. Something closer to exhaustion finally being allowed to rest. Judge Marian Alvarez, a stern woman in her 60s who had clearly seen every version of family fraud a courtroom could produce, addressed Victoria directly before reading the sentence. Ms. Ashford, what troubles this court most is not simply the financial scheme itself, but the deliberate isolation of a young woman from her own father during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life, timed specifically to a wedding day meant to be about love and family, and used instead as a mechanism of control. That is a betrayal that goes beyond dollars and cents. Richard said very little throughout his own sentencing, other than a brief statement acknowledging that he had let desperation over the company's collapse override every better instinct he had left. I believed him, for whatever that's worth. I don't think Richard Ashford woke up one morning and decided to become a man who would use his son's wedding as cover for fraud. I think he simply kept making one small compromise after another until there was no line left to cross. Part 16, What Came After. Daniel and Claire did not get married that June, and for a long time, I honestly didn't know if they ever would. It took nearly a year of separate therapy, careful conversations, and Daniel's own decision to walk away entirely from what remained of Ashford development rather than try to salvage any piece of the family business, before Claire told me, over a Sunday dinner much like the ones we'd always had, that she thought she wanted to try again with him, slowly, on entirely different terms this time. They married the following autumn, in a small ceremony of 40 guests at the same botanical garden that had originally been the plan before Victoria took over the planning. I walked my daughter down the aisle myself, and I was on every single page of the guest list this time, seated in the front row, exactly where a father belongs. Daniel gave a toast that night that I still think about. He said, "I spent 31 years believing my family's version of success. It took losing almost all of it to understand that the only thing worth protecting was the person standing next to me, and the people who told me the truth even when it cost them everything to do it. Claire's trust remains exactly as I originally set it up, in her name alone, no co-trustees, no amendments, and I have never once suggested otherwise, because that fund was never meant to be leverage for anyone. It was meant to be hers. I still run Meridian Bridge Partners. I look at the names behind the shell companies a little more carefully now than I used to, not out of paranoia, but out of the plain understanding that the people asking for your money and the people asking for your trust are not always working from the same intentions, and sometimes the only way to find out which is to look closely enough that they can't hide from you anymore. A few things I want you to take with you. If this family story has taught me anything, it's this. The people closest to you can sometimes be the hardest to see clearly, not because they're cruel, but because love makes you want to give them the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt should have won. Trust your instincts when something feels engineered rather than organic. A guest list that quietly shrinks. Decisions made without you and explained after the fact. A loved one who suddenly looks exhausted in a way that doesn't match the happy occasion around them. These are not overreactions. They are data, and data deserves to be examined, not dismissed. A final gentle reminder before you go: while this account draws on real and common patterns of financial elder exploitation and family manipulation, certain names, details, and events have been dramatized for the purposes of this telling. If this kind of story isn't for you, I understand completely, and I hope you'll find something else here that suits you better. But if it helped you, even a little, consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this one still to tell, and I'd love for you to be here when I tell them. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know.